On August 4, 1757, the cannons of Brigadier General Marquis de Montcalm began pounding Fort William Henry, signaling the start of a brutal siege. A massive French force, backed by Native American allies, squared off against a small garrison of British regulars and provincial troops. The stakes couldn't have been higher. By 1757, New France and the 13 colonies were deeply entangled in the expanding 7 Years' War, a string of missteps by British commanders. William Shirley and Lord Loudon had left the New York frontier dangerously exposed. Their failure to maintain effective intelligence over the winter of 1756-57 opened the door to a French surprise attack. With most British troops tied up in campaigns against New France's heartland at Louisbourg, Fort Edward stood as the only barrier between the British colonies and a potential French breakthrough. The siege of Fort William Henry would be marked by a series of ruthless raids and ambushes. The largest naval fleet ever seen on Lake George up to that point. Cultural misunderstandings between Europeans and native allies, and ultimately, a shocking massacre. These dramatic events would later be immortalized in Michael Mann's 1992 epic The Last of the Mohicans. Based on James Fenimore Cooper's 1826 novel and its 1936 film adaptation. In August 1756, a French force of roughly 2,500 men, supported by 250 native allies, under the command of Louis Joseph de Montcalm, Marquis de Montcalm de Saint-Véran-Montcalm for short, arrived near Forts Oswego and Ontario at the western end of Lake Ontario. The British garrison under Colonel James Mercer was poorly supplied and weakened by disease. They could only watch as the French began digging siege trenches toward Fort Ontario on the eastern shore of the river. Just a few hundred meters from Fort Oswego, within a single day, the trenches reached the fort. Before the French could even bring up their large cannons, Mercer abandoned Fort Ontario and retreated to Oswego. Montcalm seized the fort and set up artillery batteries on the western heights, targeting Oswego's exposed east side. In just one more day, Oswego's walls were breached. When Mercer was killed by a cannonball, Lieutenant Colonel John Littlehales raised the white flag, surrendering the fort and his men. Montcalm, a man who valued military honor, viewed the surrender as premature. Unlike the usual practice, he refused to allow the British garrison to leave freely. Instead, the soldiers were taken prisoner, while civilians, mainly traders, and their families were allowed to leave the next day. After the French entered the fort, chaos erupted. Soldiers, Canadians, and native allies began helping themselves to the fort's rum. Some British soldiers tried to escape but were swiftly cut down by native warriors wielding tomahawks. The situation spiraled out of control. Sick prisoners were scalped, trading posts looted, personal property seized, and families captured. For the native allies, who earned little beyond occasional gifts, this was their way of claiming spoils. Montcalm was reportedly embarrassed by the violence, which clashed with European customs regarding prisoners. He vowed never to rely on native warriors again, but as history would show, he could not keep that promise. Instead of discouraging them, the events at Fort Oswego spread the word among native communities. Joining the French promised both riches and trophies. The fall of Fort Oswego was a major blow to the British in the French and Indian War. It weakened their control over the Lake Ontario frontier, leaving what historian William Nestor calls an uncontested French sea. French forces could now threaten Albany, and more native warriors joined their cause. By August 1756, 2 years of war had delivered mostly failure and hardship for the British Empire. Historian Fred Anderson points to several causes: confusion in the chain of command, the French's skilled use of native allies, and tensions between the Crown and the American colonies over troops, funding, and discipline. Meanwhile, the outbreak of the 7 Years' War in Europe stretched Britain thin. The French had mobilized aggressively, capturing Minorca in May 1756, leaving fewer resources for the colonies. The man tasked with turning the tide in America was John Campbell, the 4th Earl of Loudoun. Arriving in late July 1756, Loudoun quickly learned of Oswego's loss and the fragile state of the northern frontier. He devised a bold plan: strike at Quebec City, the heart of New France, to force the French to divert forces from the frontier. Meanwhile, he would secure the region with 2 key forts: Fort Edward on the Hudson River and Fort William Henry at the southern tip of Lake George. To implement this, Loudoun sent his best troops to Quebec, leaving only a few regulars under Brigadier General Daniel Webb to defend New York's frontier. According to Fred Anderson, Webb was prone to panic and overreact, hardly ideal for such a critical assignment. To make matters worse, London had yet to fully approve Loudoun's plans. A change in government brought William Pitt as Secretary of State in December, preoccupied with pressing European conflicts. Capitalizing on these delays, French and native raiding parties began gathering in the dense forests of New York, moving south on the lakes, occupying islands, and marching along the shoreline, threatening to unravel the fragile British defenses. Winter did not slow the fighting. In the bitter cold of what is now upstate New York, French forces and their native allies continued probing British defenses along Lake George and the upper Hudson River. With intelligence scarce, the British dispatched Robert Rogers and his rangers to scout the shoreline. These men were among the few non-native forces able to operate effectively on the harsh frontier in winter, earning them a reputation as the forebears of today's Army Rangers. Their survival depended on knowledge passed down through generations' roots, hidden paths, and techniques for moving silently across snowy terrain. On January 21, 1757, Rogers' men, equipped with snowshoes, spotted several sleds moving across the frozen lake and attempted an interception. But they were spotted too early, allowing most of the sleds to escape. Rogers only captured 2 prisoners, who revealed that a raiding party was stationed at Fort Carillon, known to the British as Fort Ticonderoga. Realizing they were outnumbered, Rogers ordered a retreat. However, the sleds had already warned the French-Canadian raiding party, which quickly pursued the Rangers and set up an ambush in the deep snow of the forest. The harsh winter was both a curse and a blessing. The terrain trapped the Rangers, but wet powder caused many French muskets to misfire, preventing an even greater disaster. The battle raged for hours. By sunset, over half of Rogers' Rangers had been killed. The survivors, battered and bloodied, managed to fight their way back to Fort William Henry under cover of darkness. Meanwhile, the captured Rangers were taken by sled to Fort Carillon, where they confirmed that British spies in London had already reported plans for a major offensive against Quebec City rather than focusing on Lake George and the New York frontier. This intelligence arrived at the perfect time for the French. Gouverneur Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil, Marquis de Vaudreuil, had been recruiting native allies since December 1756, readying them for precisely these frontier battles. This proved incredibly easy for him. Many native warriors eagerly joined after hearing about the plunder taken at Fort Oswego. With Rogers' Rangers decimated and numerous men too wounded to return to duty, the British lost their most reliable source of frontier intelligence. From that point on, they had no eyes on Lake George. By mid-March, a force of 1,500 French, Canadian, and native warriors, led by Francois de Rigaud de Vaudreuil, Governor Vaudreuil's younger brother, advanced down the frozen waters of Lake George using sledges. Their target, Fort William Henry. Upon arrival, Rigaud's men harassed the small winter garrison for relentless days. Firing from hidden positions, they kept the defenders constantly on edge, even more than the sporadic gunfire. The sheer presence of such a large enemy force so close to the walls unnerved the British troops. However, Rigaud's men lacked the heavy artillery needed for a full-scale assault. Armed only with muskets and ladders, they couldn't breach the fort's thick walls and sturdy defenses.
needed for a...
Instead, they focused on everything outside the fort, burning buildings, destroying boats, and ravaging the surrounding area, crippling the garrison's ability to scout or launch operations in the coming spring. After 4 days, Rigaud withdrew, but the raids didn't stop. The forests surrounding Fort William Henry were alive with native warriors, sneaking closer to the fort, drawn by promises of glory and plunder. They ambushed supply trains, raided outposts, and patrolled the wilderness between Fort Edward and the fort, making travel and resupply extremely dangerous. Historian Fred Anderson notes. So, effectively did the Indians and Canadian irregulars confine the Rangers to the vicinity of the British forts that General Webb and his senior officers were deprived of virtually all intelligence concerning French preparations for the coming campaigns. With British forces trapped behind their walls and cut off from crucial information, the French had gained a decisive advantage just as the spring thaw approached. By the end of March, Lord Loudon finally received a response from William Pitt in London. His proposed campaign against Quebec City was approved, but only if he captured Louisbourg first. The French, of course, had no intention of following this plan. Meanwhile, native warriors from dozens of tribes flocked to Montreal, some traveling over 1,500 miles. Inspired by tales of the British defeat at Oswego and Rigaud's devastating raids. Deeply resentful of the British, whom they saw as land-hungry invaders in contrast to the trading French, these warriors rallied behind Montcalm and Vaudreuil, eager to take the war to their enemy. Though Montcalm had vowed after Oswego never to rely on native warriors again, the sheer number of volunteers made that impossible. By summer 1757, Montcalm commanded over 8,000 French, Canadian, and native troops, and he soon set his sights on Lake George, sending scouts steadily down the lake toward Fort William Henry. Still lacking intelligence, the British replaced Fort William Henry's winter garrison with just 1,500 men under Lieutenant Colonel George Munro. By sheer luck, two escaped prisoners reported in late June that a massive French native army around 8,000 strong was gathering at Fort Carillon. Munro immediately requested reinforcements from Webb and sent scouts out along the lake. None returned. There was no way to confirm if a full-scale attack was imminent. To be safe, the British planned a scouting mission by boat. They rebuilt their fleet, but it wasn't ready until mid-July. On July 23rd, Colonel John Parker led 22 small boats north to Sabbath Day Point. Parker sent 2 boats ahead to scout a landing site. As the main force of 20 boats approached, they spotted figures on the shore waving to them and assumed all was clear. In reality, the vanguard had already been killed, and the figures were French decoys, luring the British into a deadly trap. Hidden among the trees, French soldiers and native allies waited for the unsuspecting troops. As Parker's boats drew near, a sudden barrage of musket fire tore through their ranks. At the same time, canoes filled with warriors surged around the point, encircling the British before they could react. The ambush was swift and brutal. Warriors leaped from the canoes, sinking nearly every boat only for manage to escape. Defenseless, the British swam for their lives, with many dragged under, speared, or drowned. The battered survivors staggered back to Fort William Henry, arriving just as General Daniel Webb visited for the first time. Shaken and horrified, they recounted the ambush in harrowing detail, revealing just how entrenched the French and native presence on the frontier had become. Webb and Munro acted immediately. All British regulars were ordered into the fort, while provincials took position atop Titcomb Mount, a strategic rise about 700 meters from the fort. They built a fortified camp to deny the French the high ground, a lesson learned from the disaster at Fort Oswego. Webb did not remain to reinforce the fort. Concerned that Fort Edward, his primary command, would be left vulnerable, he departed, sending only 200 British regulars and 800 provincials to bolster Fort William Henry. On the evening of August 2nd, as these reinforcements arrived, Massive fires erupted along the western shore of Lake George, roughly 11 kilometers from the fort. The garrison sent a scouting boats to investigate. They never returned. At dawn, the defenders of Fort William Henry saw a massive fleet on the dark surface of the lake, 250 bateaux, and at least 150 native war canoes moving steadily toward them. Among them, 60 bateaux had been lashed together into a giant raft carrying heavy French artillery. Meanwhile, a large advance party under Brigadier Francois Gaston, Chevalier de Lévis Montcalm, along the shore, taking positions in the woods behind the fort toward Fort Edward. From there, they began sniping at defenders from the garrison gardens. Montcalm then landed and sent a messenger to Munro, demanding the fort's surrender. Humanity obliges me to warn that it would not be in my power to restrain the cruelties of a mob of Indians of so many different nations. To make the threat clear, native warriors formed a massive semicircle near the fort, yelling in French and shouting warnings, "Defend yourselves, for if I capture you, I will give no quarter." Munro, however, politely refused. Despite the danger, the fort was not defenseless. It held 18 heavy cannons, 13 light swivel guns, to mortar, a howitzer, and a fortified provincial camp atop Titcomb's Mount. The defenders could inflict heavy losses, but they knew their chances were limited. Without reinforcements from Fort Edward within 2 to 3 days, the fort's fall was almost certain. Munro sent couriers to Webb at Fort Edward, warning him of Montcalm's massive army and the ongoing siege. On the morning of August 4th, Montcalm's engineers built an artillery battery less than half a mile from the fort's north bastion. Soon, the first thunderous blasts shattered the ramparts, sending wood splinters flying in every direction. At this stage, the French guns could only strike the upper sections of the fort's walls. The glacis, a small earthen slope outside the ditch, blocked their cannons from targeting the lower walls. To solve this, Montcalm ordered his men to dig approach trenches, giving them cover as they inched closer to the fort. These trenches would allow the French to bring their cannons nearer and eventually set up breaching batteries to attack the fort's base and weaken its defenses from close range. As the artillery duel raged on, the native warriors in the French ranks were awestruck by the sheer destructive power of the guns. Curious, they sometimes asked if they could fire them, and a few French soldiers, eager to build goodwill, let them take a turn. Meanwhile, the British returned fire with their own heavy artillery. They fired so relentlessly that their cannons began to show signs of strain, and the risk of barrels bursting became a serious concern. To prevent disaster, the British had to pause periodically to cool their guns between volleys. Across the fort, Levis had positioned his troops in front of Titcomb's Mount. His Canadian and native scouts made it nearly impossible for the provincials to leave their entrenched camp. In the dense forests, native war parties stalked and ambushed any couriers trying to reach Fort Edward, effectively cutting off all communication with General Webb. Despite the defenders' efforts, Montcalm's forces completed their first siege parallel quickly. Near this line, they established another, which on August 6th, the French dug closer to the fort. By the morning of August 7th, a new battery was in place, and an approach trench reached just 270 meters from the western wall, shrinking the distance to the fort at an alarming pace. Later that day, Montcalm sent a messenger to Munro under a truce flag. The man carried a blood-stained letter from one of Webb's couriers, captured by Montcalm's scouts. The letter warned that General Webb does not think it prudent to attempt a junction or to assist you, and suggested that Munro might make the best terms of capitulation possible. Montcalm added a polite note urging Munro to heed Webb's advice and surrender, emphasizing the fort's dire situation. Munro, however, refused. Determined not to repeat the mistake made by Little Hales at Oswego, he held out, knowing the fort's walls were still intact. In response, the French unleashed an unrelenting barrage of howitzer fire on the fort. The British fought back, but their guns, pushed to the limit, frequently burst, injuring their crews. Biagust oitu morale among the defenders was nearly broken. For days they had endured sleepless nights under constant bombardment, returning fire while repairing damaged defenses. Late in the afternoon, engineers inspected the fort. The report was grim. The top 3 feet of the bastions most exposed to French fire were destroyed. Casements within those bastions severely damaged. Only 5 of the fort's cannons still operational and ammunition supplies nearly exhausted. The provincials on Titcomb's Mount had suffered even heavier losses from indirect French fire. That night, the French completed a new battery just 300 yards from the western wall. With the situation worsening, Munro knew it was time to negotiate. At 1 p.m. on August 9th, the defenders raised a white flag. Montcalm and Munro agreed that the entire garrison would be allowed safe passage to Fort Edward under French escort. As a mark of respect, the British could keep their personal items, small arms, unit colors, and a symbolic cannon, though no ammunition would be allowed. However, the terms did not satisfy Montcalm's native allies. Many had joined the campaign seeking spoils, scalps, captives, muskets, powder, but had received little. For these warriors, the war was about proving their prowess in battle and taking valuable loot. Now, they were left empty-handed and bitter. Montcalm tried to persuade them to honor the surrender terms, promising to restrain his warriors, but historians debate how realistic this was. Some suggest he may have genuinely believed he could protect the British, while others argue he knowingly risked it. Either way, the native warriors, deeply resentful and outnumbering the French, had little reason to obey. Violence erupted late in the afternoon of August 9th, as the British garrison left Fort William Henry to wait for the French escort to Fort Edward. Native warriors surged into the fort. Immediately, they began looting, scalping, and attacking the sick and wounded left behind. As confirmed by the grim archaeological record of the fort's hospital. Tragically, the violence of that day may have been just as devastating for the native warriors as for their victims. Many were likely exposed to smallpox, influenza, and tuberculosis diseases that, in the years that followed, would claim more indigenous lives than any battle in the war. French soldiers and missionaries tried to intervene, but the anger of the warriors, frustrated by the lack of expected spoils, was nearly impossible to control. Throughout the afternoon and into the evening, they continued to harass the British troops in the entrenched camp, looting possessions and terrorizing the exhausted soldiers. It wasn't until 9 p.m. that the French finally managed to drive them from the camp, but the danger was far from over. The warriors lingered just beyond the perimeter, their intentions clear and ominous. Exhausted, sleep-deprived, and gripped by fear, the British regulars, provincial soldiers, and camp followers gathered the next morning, dreading what lay ahead. The regulars led the column, but as soon as they stepped outside, hundreds of native warriors armed with muskets, knives, and tomahawks swarmed the formation, shouting terrifying war cries and demanding weapons, supplies, and clothing. Meanwhile, others poured into the camp where the provincials and camp followers were waiting to march to Fort Edward. Surrounded, low on ammunition, and packed together, they could do little as the warriors looted their possessions and worse. Women, children, and African Americans were seized and carried off, vanishing into the chaos. As the column began its march, French soldiers flanked the regulars at the front, doing their best to keep the worst violence in check. Montcalm himself tried to restrain the warriors, often putting his own life at risk. Still, the provincials and camp followers toward the back were left largely to fend for themselves. Native warriors moved along the column's flanks, harassing, looting, and capturing people before disappearing into the forest. The wounded, unable to defend themselves, were scalped or dragged away, while others were stripped of clothing and belongings. Panic spread rapidly. Some huddled together. Others fled in every direction, into the woods, the French camp, or toward Fort Edward. Suddenly, war cries echoed through the trees, and dozens of warriors surged forward, tomahawking those at the rear of the column. The attacks lasted only minutes, and then, as quickly as they appeared, the warriors vanished into the forest, taking scalps, captives, and plunder. Most of the native fighters left the French army immediately after, or over the following days. When the chaos finally ended, the British had lost 185 soldiers and camp followers. Around 500 more were captured, while another 300 to 500 provincials and regulars found safety with the French. With most of Montcalm's native allies gone, supplies running low, cannonballs spent, and the campaign season drawing to a close, he was unable or unwilling to push further to Fort Edward. Eventually, he retreated to Fort Colonial. In the end, Munro's brave defense of Fort William Henry and the terrifying massacre that followed had an unexpected outcome for the British. The French advance stalled, exhausted and lacking support from their native allies. However, Munro never lived to enjoy even this small victory. He died later that year from apoplexy, which some historians believe was caused by frustration with Webb. Webb himself was recalled for his poor decisions, and Loudon was relieved after failing to capture Louisbourg, returning to New York empty-handed. The year 1757 had been an utter and complete failure for the British Empire. And that's the story of Fort William Henry, a tale of courage, strategy, and tragedy that changed the course of the French and Indian War, from the relentless siege to the chaos of the massacre. It's a stark reminder of how history is shaped by both human bravery and human error. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss any of the incredible stories we uncover here at History Vault. We've got countless battles, legends, and untold tales waiting for you, each one bringing history to life like never before. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the vault where history lives.